Thank you all for turning out on such a beautiful evening for this evening's Mansfield Public Talk. For those people who don't know me, my name's Helen Mountfield. I'm the principal here, and I'm very pleased to have speaking this evening Jemimah Steinfeld, who is the Chief Executive of Index on Censorship. Index is a UK-based organisation that reports and campaigns on freedom of expression around the world. Conflict of interest alert, I'm a trustee of Index, but Jemimah knows far more about it than I do and is going to be able to explain to you some of Index's work. And she's worked at Index since 2017 when she joined as a deputy editor of its award-winning magazine. Her history before that is that she has lived and worked in China, in Shanghai and Beijing, and she's written on a wide range of topics with particular focus on youth culture, gender and censorship. And she's written a book with a wonderful title, Little Emperors and Material Girls, Sex and Youth in Modern China. And she's also done lots of journalism in lots of places that people in this room will read, like The Guardian and The Telegraph and The HuffPost and things like that. So she's going to speak this evening on the actual most dangerous speech in the UK, and she's going to tell you what it is. So thank you very much, Jemimah.
Thank you so much for coming here today and hearing me speak. It is the most beautiful day. I've actually been to Oxford a few times in the last couple of years, and it's always been days like this, and I'm beginning to think that it doesn't rain here. So thank you, Helen, very much for inviting me and for doing that introduction, which was pretty thorough, kind of got to the main points. So as was probably made clear, I came to Index in 2017. Before that, I was the contributing editor for Index for the magazine about China, and so a lot of my entry level into censorship and free speech issues were within a Chinese context, of which there were lots of issues there. When I first started in 2017, we were UK based and we did always do things on the UK. But I would say that in the 8.5 years since I've been there, the UK keeps on coming up more and more. And I'm not going to be as shrill as J.D. Vance and things and say that we have an absolute terrible free speech crisis here, but we certainly do have some significant problems, and I will be addressing them now. So, I will also be doing it with tech, which I will hopefully be able to do. Here we go. I'm going to briefly talk about some issues, very briefly. And then I'm going to dive into one in a lot more detail, and that will become clear soon, and as why. So there are lots of issues that, and I'm probably talking to a crowd of people who know quite a lot about these, there are lots of issues that we are dealing with that I would call homegrown issues to an extent. So one of the main ones that at Index we work on is the phenomenon that we've called SLAPs. So strategic lawsuits against public participation. These are typically defamation lawsuits that target journalists and generally, but they can target really everyone, and it's essentially where a rich and powerful person comes after someone for saying something that they will claim is, as I said, usually defamatory, but because of the way that our legal system's structured, they can have an incredibly flimsy case, but they can still go very, very far down and pretty much cripple the person who has said it. And that has had I hate to use these words together, but in a free speech talk, but it has had a chilling effect on lots of newsrooms and things, and there are plenty of stories that get silently forgotten and put to the side. And it's also an issue that doesn't just affect journalists. So one of the most kind of colourful cases, I suppose you could call it, that I've come across concerns the Signature Clinic, which is a chain of plastic surgery and cosmetic surgery clinics. Some people have had surgeries that they felt were where the outcome was bad. They have complained, they've been ignored, they've gone to the equivalent of Trustpilot, which we all do. Let's say, like, I'm not going to ask for a hand raise, but I think probably everyone here in the last 10, 20 years has written a negative review online at some stage, I'm going to guess. They've written negative reviews, and they have been hounded by the surgery for huge costs. These are people who have had surgery where they felt very vulnerable. So in addition to people like Kara Cadwallader, cases that you probably heard of, where she has been slapped with such fees, legal fees, that she's thought about mortgaging her own home or selling her own home, we also have these legal suits affecting just the average person kind of coming completely out of nowhere. They just did not expect it. So that is one. This is all a bit cluttered, but this is just to kind of present some of the news stories surrounding some of them. So slaps is definitely one, the impact that it has on media freedom, but also just the more broad impact that it can have on speech. Of course, I would be remiss not to talk about cancellation. You know, the typical trend, someone says something that's offensive, but it's usually legal, and offensive according to some people, other people might not think it's offensive, and they ultimately pay a huge price, whether it's they are bullied and harassed in a way that's just emotionally traumatic, or whether they're actually bullied and harassed to the point of career repercussions. This impacts in lots of different industries. I have just been reading about the impact on the arts. So a recent survey published last week said that 483 artists and arts professionals now feel unable to speak openly without risking career damage, exclusion, or harassment. And some of the topics you might say, some of the ways they've gone about it, you might say, well, maybe they deserve that, maybe they don't, I don't know. But certainly some of the things, to me at least, seem so astonishingly unreasonable for people to take offence that it almost takes my breath away. So one person simply said that she was removed by bullying from an arts collective because she was critical of Hamas. She simply condemned an organisation that slaughters people, and for that she was removed. At the same time, we've seen cancellations for people on completely the other side. So we know that the Barbican removed an artist ahead of doing a talk that was called Israel After the Show, I think was its words, because it took a critical stance on Israel. So we have a situation where there's deep polarization, there's deep lack of appetite for views that are seen as on the other side or vaguely controversial, and lots of people either suffer the consequences if they speak or they self-censor. Some places have tried to come up with solutions. The solutions, in my opinion, aren't necessarily any better. I'm standing at a university. I'm very aware that everyone would have, I'm sure, discussed the fine that was put onto the University of Sussex because of Kathleen Stock. Now, I think what happened to her was probably troubling, but I also think that response is troubling because universities now are incredibly worried that they could fall foul of a fine that was so incredibly stinging, especially in a sector that's not exactly known for its money. So, you know, University of Sussex are pushing back because they think that they're saying that they're being persecuted. The other core tenet of a free speech environment is protest in terms of just physically going out onto the streets. Again, we have seen some real damage done to these rights in the UK in recent years. In 2022, the Police Crime Sentencing in Courts Act handed police in England and Wales broad powers to shut down protests and expanded criminal offences and punishment for peaceful protest activities. This was followed by even more draconian law in the form of the Public Order Act 2023 and the Serious Disruption Regulations 2023. And essentially the manifestation of this is that people can't protest in the ways they used to be able to, even though if it's peaceful, they can't protest in the same places they used to be able to. We have Just Stop Oil protesters in prison for 4 and 5 year terms for planning a disruptive, but a peaceful protest. Not even doing it, they were just planning it. It's so out of step with the rest of Europe. People from my background, in China. People in China have laughed. They've said, you can't criticize us for what you're doing. You've got, for what we're doing to protesters, you've got protesters in jail for 5 years too. So I think this is serious, serious overreach. A few other things that we have that really concern me. There is a teacher from Batley Grammar who is still in hiding because of showing in a lesson about religious studies and about tolerance and challenging dogma and stuff, showing a picture of the Prophet Muhammad. He is still in hiding 3 years on. People don't even seem to be completely outraged about it, but he's still in hiding. The far right managed to stop a film being shown at the BFI. I could do a list of the amount of challenges that hit my desk every single day in the UK, and we're a global organisation. Every single day, I don't want to be talking about the UK. I want to be talking about what's happening in Iran, what's happening in Turkey, what's happening, dare I say it, in the USA these days. But what is happening in the UK is still a problem, and it's a problem actually because it's a problem in general, but it's also a problem because we can't, as a UK-based organisation, hold our head up high if we don't feel that we're looking at what's happening on our own doorstep. Now, I don't want to get into what I call the repression Olympics, I'm the most persecuted, no, I'm the most persecuted, because I genuinely believe that all of the examples I've listed, and this is just a real snapshot, but I genuinely believe that if you lose your job, if your reputation gets completely slaughtered publicly, if you live in a safe home, I genuinely believe that you all deserve a piece of the brownie. But there is one bit, and maybe it's because of my own background here, there is some speech that I personally think, from where I'm standing, is the most dangerous if I had to give an award. And that is the speech that criticises, in the UK, states elsewhere. And I'm going to tell you now why. So, in 2016, a sociologist called Dana M. Moss coined the term transnational repression. I have to say I don't care for the term, I think it's clunky. I would love it to be a sexier term. I've tried to think of better ways of doing it, but it really actually does what it says on the tin. And it is essentially when foreign states reach beyond their borders to suppress speech. This was in 2016 that the term was coined, but it is not a new phenomenon. In 1896, for example, the Sun Yat-sen, who went on to become the president of the Republic of China, he escaped to London for a period in exile from the Qing dynasty. And he was, by all accounts, a creature of habit during this time. So he would get up in the morning, he lived in Bloomsbury, and he would get up and I think he would visit the British Museum, and he would do some things. Now, if you are a high-profile exile and your regime's out to get you, being a creature of habit is probably the last thing you should be. And so one day he's walking somewhere on his routine, and he was approached by some men who chatted to him, and then they bundled him into the Chinese legation at that time, 49 Portland Street. It is now the Chinese embassy. And they kept him there for about 2 weeks, and if he hadn't managed to have enough friends in the UK and managed to get the word out and kick up enough fuss, the idea was he would have been sent back to China where he would have been executed. So that was 130 odd years ago. And I'm sure there are examples that would go further back. We have examples from the Cold War, the Bulgarian dissident who was assassinated with an umbrella, grimly, on Waterloo Bridge. In 1980, the academic Jack I. Garvey wrote of the US, but I believe, as the Bulgarian example shows, that it applies to the UK. Consider a society where persons of a certain class are targeted by foreign powers for murder, assault, and extortion. The domestic police forces rarely protect victims and occasionally even aid the foreign predator. Moreover, in this society, the executive refuses to enforce statutes available to constrain this activity. The description could be a political fiction from an Orwellian pen. It is, however, reality for many political emigres residing in the United States. In 2006, Alexander Litvinenko was another one, a former Russian spy living in London. He was obviously fatally poisoned. It was linked back to Russia. Again, there are quite a lot of these cases, but I can count them on my hands, I would say. So why was it that the term got coined in 2016? Well, obviously in the intervening periods, there were huge changes to technology. And this meant that we could reach people incredibly easily in terms of sending messages to them. Spyware changed. We all had mobile phones. We could be tracked. So there were many, many different changes. And this meant that what went from being the highest profile political refugees became suddenly pretty much anyone. And I mean anyone. Anyone can be attacked for what they say. And I'm going to tell you now how they are being attacked on the UK with quite a lot of regularity. So transnational repression can be divided into, it manifests in so many different ways, but I think this is a useful way, sticking to Dana Moss's own categorization, I find this a useful way of looking at it. So lethal retribution, threat, surveillance, exile, withdrawing scholarships, and proxy punishments. So lethal retribution, that is exactly what it says on the tin. This is attempts on people's lives, some successful, some not. These are just a few cases that we've seen. So the journalists at Iran International, many of them have been attacked. The most recent one was Pouria Zarati, who was knifed in the leg outside his home in Wimbledon. So they found him, they found where he lived, and they attacked him. He fortunately survived. Ghanem al-Masari, he's Saudi Arabian. He came over in the early noughties, to study here. He didn't expect to stay here. He became friends with some dissidents here from Saudi Arabia. They let him know that if he was to go back to Saudi Arabia, he would be in trouble. But 10 years later, he was in trouble here. So he was very badly beaten outside Harrods in 2018. We've had a Bahraini activist who whilst doing a protest outside the Bahraini embassy, he scaled the embassy basically because there was scaffolding, at which stage he got threatened and got hit, and he thought he was going to be pushed off. Of course, in these things, they haven't been successful. So these people have lived to tell the tale. Obviously, we've seen in places like Turkey where Jamal Khashoggi went into an embassy never to come out, that just because these haven't been successful does not mean that we should relax. There are many dissidents that I meet who walk different ways every time they leave the house. Nathan Law is one of the biggest protest leaders from Hong Kong who lives here. He constantly moves house. He will never tell anyone his address. He never takes the same path. All because of the scale of threats that he sees and the seriousness that he takes them, and he's right to take them seriously. Now, this is a bit more of a broad term, threats, because I think that this could be anything from entry level to much more serious. So you can see actually the picture from, my favourite picture from the Tiananmen Square protests before the crackdown over there. I posted that a year ago, just saying I like to look at this picture at this time to remember that there could have been a different China. And I was absolutely bombarded by comments. So there's 417. Most of these were not positive. I haven't really experienced much like that until that moment. It was last year, it was about 8 months after the 7th of October when Israel had retaliated in Gaza, and I was called for, and I don't comment hugely on that, and if I do, it's usually very critical of Netanyahu and Israel. But what I think has happened is that lots of people on the China side have realized that there are more sophisticated ways to get to people and really try and emotionally hurt them. So I had about 5 days where I was called a genocidal Jew who needed to shut the F up, basically. And why am I talking about this when I've got Palestinian kids' blood on my shoulders? And it was vicious. Fortunately, I work at Index on censorship. You can't work here without having quite thick skin. So I mostly just rolled my eyes. But that's just an example of something that happened to me for a very innocent post on the whole on Twitter, which is not even accessible in China. I would call that incredibly entry level. It is nothing compared to what the people in my network go through. So if you see below, there's son of a bitch, wild bastard, dog traitor, scumbags, traitor, cockroach. That is what someone called Simon Cheng regularly gets. This was in relation to a photo that he posted of him going to King Charles's coronation. He is from Hong Kong. He lives over here. He is, again, a high-profile protest leader from Hong Kong. We have plenty of other examples of people who will say something critical online, and for that they will be absolutely hounded, or they will just be hounded for who they are. It's not, though, just about China, Saudi Arabia and things. There are many different countries. So actually one of the most shocking cases I think I've come across, and I think lots of people find this surprising, is the attempts that the Rwandan government goes to silence dissent. In terms of death threat, in terms of the past pint about attempts to kill people, whilst I have no examples of it happening here, in Brussels they have a quite sizable dissident Rwandan community, and for the most high-profile people there, they will not, if they don't know people, they will not shake their hands and things, because there have been incidences where they've had, where someone has had Novichok poison on their hands and will try and shake the hands of the Rwandan dissident. The idea being that they won't know, they will die, but the person who's got it on their hands can take an antidote very quickly afterwards, and so they will be okay. So they won't, knowing that, they won't shake their hands. But over here, I don't know of those incidences, but what I do know is that we have people like Michaela Wrong, who is a very esteemed writer and journalist, who has experienced such a high level of threats online that she, as she said, I often wake screaming in the night, convinced Rwandan agents have broken into my flat. In the morning, I sometimes find chairs, duvets and pillows stuffed against the front door. My anxiety has bubbled up in my sleep. It is anxiety, but it is completely understandable because she gets horrendous death threats all the time. All the time. We work closely with the lawyers at Doughty Street Chambers on lots of cases. They have found their emails impersonated. They get rape threats all the time. They get death threats. These things are just relentless for the people who go and take on the cases or have speech that is critical of lots of these governments. So, surveillance. Obviously, the gathering of information to send back to the state apparatus by informant networks, which is usually composed of regime agents, loyalists, and coerced individuals. Lots of how the death threats, lots of how it works, functions on the actual street level is through surveillance, and that can be people turning up to protests to spy on other people, and we organise events mostly with the Hong Kong community, I would say, and the Chinese community, where we will not take people's names when they walk in, because we do not, in case someone turns up who is not a dissident or not in favour of the free expression that's being expressed, in case they look at our clipboard and they try and take note of who's there. So people will be surveyed in that way. People rightfully in these situations, I had someone last year turn up to an event we organised on Tiananmen Square, and they were wearing the nets that you use sometimes for your laundry, where you put things like your bras in. They had put one of those nets over their whole face to conceal themselves, as well as obviously wearing face masks and caps. But that, for me, was particularly visceral, seeing someone's entire face covered in a net, a laundry net. But you know, I completely understand, because for lots of these people, they talk about being followed back from protests. There is a level of surveillance. Just this week, 6 Bulgarians have been sentenced to years in prison in the UK for spying. One of their targets was the Bellingcat investigative journalist Christo Grozev, who is also the subject of many very extreme threats to his life. So he hasn't, I don't think, seen his family for quite a while, because it is not safe. That he has to keep on travelling, and he has to keep them safe, basically, and keep himself safe. We interviewed a few years ago a Rwandan exile who lives in Leeds in the UK called Faustin Rukundo. He decided to flee Rwanda as he, to quote him, wanted to live, be free, have a life that is not controlled. Around 2019, he noticed that his WhatsApp was doing incredibly strange things. And so he went to an organisation called Citizen Lab, who ran a spyware thing through the phone, and it was revealed that he had Pegasus on his phone. So lots of people are being surveyed in a variety of ways, either people directly just going to protests, seeing them, or remotely accessing their tools. So exile. This refers to the direct and indirect banishment of dissidents from their home country, including when the threat of physical confinement and harm preventing activists from returning. So some of these exiles, like Nathan Law, for example, he has exiled himself, but even in exile, he suffers from having a bounty on his head, so he is very much concerned that he could actually be snatched from the streets, essentially. But I would say for the most part, how exile works is exile is much more about stopping people going back to the autocratic places. Now, not everyone who arrives here is a dissident. What happens, and actually I just had an email sent to me this afternoon by someone who said they became a dissident, and a Chinese, someone from China who simply reshared a post without even thinking about it that just said we should treat ordinary Chinese people with more respect, and for that she has been blocked from everything, and she now feels she's in a position where she's been turned into a dissident, that she can't go back to China. So essentially the exile thing is more relating to a different way in which this repression manifests, which is a kind of, it's basically saying, if you say that, we're not going to let you come to our country. And that for some people can be incredibly difficult for their careers. So I have heard about when Modi first got into power, and it continues to this day, plenty of academics have been denied entry to the country. So in 2014, Penny Vera Sanso of Birkbeck University, who had been visiting India since the 1990s and writes about gender, she was denied entry. In 2022, Lindsay Bremner, who teaches architecture at the University of Westminster, had a valid visa, and that was stripped off her at the airport when she was actually in India. So, that can be incredibly damaging for academic freedom particularly, and in fact just free speech more generally, as people think, well, if I want to go to that country for whatever reason, because I've got I've got family, I've got friends, I just fancy a holiday, or I'm doing research. It does make people double think about what they can say. The other thing that we've seen, which is slightly more creative, I suppose, for want of a better word, is how people have basically their passports effectively taken away from them, which means that they can't actually enjoy the privileges unless they seek asylum of living in this country. So we work with a Belarus activist called Hannah Kumar, and she realised that she was in trouble when she called the Belarusian embassy in London to ask whether they had her new passport. Her passport had many years left actually, but she had run out of pages. This was a couple of years ago, and the man on the other end of the phone appeared to know exactly who she was. Again, the surveillance bit. They had taken photos of her when she had been at protests in England. And they had looked at her social media and they had said, you support sanctions with such vigour that we won't be providing you a service. Your new passport is ready and waiting for you in Belarus. You can go and collect it there. If you have nothing to be afraid of, why don't you go? Now, Hannah is a poet, but she's also done some protesting in Belarus, and for that she was in jail for 9 days after Lukashenko's 2020 quote-unquote election. She can't go back because she will be arrested. She has done a lot more political stuff since she left, and she will be arrested. She now is in this horrible position where she can't actually leave England. A bit of a quirk of Brexit as well. If she goes abroad, her passport will be stamped, so she pretty much can travel to, well, she can leave England, but she can't leave the British Isles. So she can't really do anything, and her only option really is to claim asylum, and she's slightly loath at this stage to do that, and I understand why. So essentially, it kind of, people get exiled because of their speech. Now, withdrawing scholarship. So this is the rescinding of student state benefits or refusing to participate in regime-mandated actions or organisations abroad. Now, I would love to actually know more examples of this. I don't know examples of this happening in the UK. What I do know is that universities who receive funding from abroad and will have a large number of overseas students do find that their courses can be compromised. There are actually many academics who believe the over-reliance on income generated from Chinese students is the single most pressing issue facing UK universities in terms of freedom of expression. I want to say here, because I think it's really important, I don't want to suggest by any means that Chinese students are all snitching on their classmates or that they all think a certain way, because I do absolutely not think that. All I know is that there are examples in the UK of Chinese students who have complained about certain courses. In the example of Michelle Shipworth at UCL, she had a course removed because she was reported on. And I do know of Chinese students and Hong Kong students who live in fear of the Chinese government's long arm. I know that I don't know if this is still a current policy, but I know at some stage that Oxford University was getting students on courses where they were writing on very political, contentious things around China to be submitting anonymously. So these things I think are pretty shocking. We've done a lot of research into freedom of expression around China's long arm. We've also looked into in that Confucius Institutes and how people who work at them are quite often vetted by the Communist Party, so in violation really of our own employment laws, they are vetted to make sure that they're politically sound, and that whilst the majority of Confucius Institutes will be teaching just plain language, some of them are very much propagating a message along Communist Party lines. And finally, there is proxy punishments. So this is, if I can't get you, I'll get everyone else you know who's still left back there. Rahima Mahmoud, the Uyghur activist, has said most Uyghurs living in Europe decide not to speak up because they still have family members and friends in East Turkestan. They fear the Chinese government will retaliate against them speaking out by harming their loved ones still in the region. And they do harm loved ones still in the region. We have just heard about, in the last few weeks, about Hong Kong dissidents here whose family have been arrested back in Hong Kong in a way to say, stop your kid over there speaking. This is an increasing problem, and again, it will make people think twice before they speak. So, on that note, this is actually a picture from Hong Kong, but it did slightly remind me of some of the things I've seen people in the UK turning up to protest wearing. On that note, what does this mean for free speech? Well, aside from the fact that obviously people here are being punished for their speech, and as said, I don't want to get into the suffering Olympics, all I think is that this is a huge problem that affects a huge amount of people, and that in many ways quite often goes under the radar. But there's the obvious thing that it's a free speech problem because there are very many people who are being very punished for what they are saying, legitimate things, nothing that should and would cause alarm here. You know, this is not hate speech. They are being punished for literally demanding rights for people back home, and they are being punished over here. It obviously, as said, causes a huge amount of self-censorship. And I totally get it. I'm completely screwed now, to be honest. Like, I can't go anywhere near China or Hong Kong, because of what I've said. So I might as well just continue. But there are many people who I don't think will make that decision. I think they would keep stum, and I do not blame them. I completely understand if your family are back home, if you want to go back to your country, if you want to live in safety here, if you want your family to live in safety, why would you take that risk unless you felt that passionately? But it is completely insane that I'm even saying this. Sometimes people are actually leaving our shores. So the threats to Iran international TV staff in London from the Iranian regime have led to the media outlet to actually flee to the USA. This was a while ago. We'll see how they get on there too. People do take extra measures, obviously, to protect themselves. Exhausting measures, constantly trying to figure out if your phone's being tapped. There are different ways you can do it. It's not very obvious if your phone is. Things like turning up to protests, wearing similar stuff to what they would wear if they were back in Hong Kong, not walking the same way, moving home, submitting essays anonymously. So there are many, many different ways in which people are trying to avoid being punished for speech that happens on our shores. So the golden question that we ask ourselves is, what can we do? One of the biggest challenges is that lots of the perpetrators aren't in the UK. Or they're hard to trace, or they're both. Hard to trace and not in the UK. So that is a huge, huge problem. But there are some things we still can do. So there's some individual actions on top of the stuff that I said before about your kind of digital hygiene, making sure that you don't expose yourself. One of the things that I found completely fascinating is that you can, in fact, take a government to court, and I'm sure there are lawyers here who know this. So the Ghanem al-Masri, the Saudi comedian who was beaten up outside Harrods, has actually taken the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to court over their use of spyware, and the Saudi government tried to repeal it, and they lost, and so it will be seen in our courts. interestingly, it seems really obvious to say you can report perpetrators to the police, but actually for some of the victims of this, they don't necessarily know that. Or they don't even necessarily trust police because they might come from a country where the police are always de facto ones not to trust, and so they don't trust that authority. But you can report it to the police, and the first time I ever really started to realise about the trend of transnational repression was in 2017 when I heard from people in my Hong Kong network that they were being sent these threatening letters, handwritten letters, to all their neighbours and to their families saying, do you know who this person is? Do you know, you're living with a traitor, or you're living next door to a traitor, or your son's a traitor. And in one case, they sent a letter to the mother of a British national, and she lived in a sleepy town in Dorset, and she reported it to the police, who apparently said it was one of the most exciting things to follow. They got absolutely nowhere. They traced it back to Hong Kong, and that's as far as it went. But people can report the perpetrators to the police. This is like lots of these people, lots of the victims, obviously do suffer psychologically, and one person said to me, which really stuck with me, she said, there's no antidepressant for a government tracking you down, but obviously people can get some psychological help. But moving on to the collective actions, because I think that also comes into it, because I think psychologically there is no antidepressant for a government tracking you down, but I think that there are certain things that we can do, and part of it is we need to gather the data. We need to get a sense of, I have so many anecdotes I've just told you, but actually no one's really gone and got all the data, the hard numbers. So we know it's big, but we don't necessarily know how big. And let's face it, everyone likes a bit of data. So we need to have a way of collecting the information, and we need it in part because we need it to know exactly how big the problem is, but we also need to have a way that collects it that people from all different communities will respond to. So again, it can't necessarily be logging it with the police, because if you come from somewhere like Iran, you might not feel comfortable going down to a local police station. So we need to set up ways to log it. We need to set up support groups, so that one of the ways in which transnational repression works is it makes people feel very isolated. Lots of people feel that they're suffering in silence, and they need to know that there are communities out there. And since we've been doing more and more work on this, we've had so many people coming to us saying how even just talking about the problem, knowing that other people are going through it, has made them feel so much better. So we need to do that. We could do things like prohibiting spyware tools. I think it's a bit guacamole, to be honest, because you prohibit one and then another one comes along. But, I think it at least does something. With these guacamole things, at least you give people a few months, make them try hard, work for it at least. The police, as I said, still do have to be part of the solution here, and I think they need to realise what it is. It was lucky for the woman in the sleepy Dorset town that they didn't have much work and they could give her the time. I think the Met Police, from what I've heard, when they've been faced with this, have literally been like, what are you talking about? I don't have enough time. I am trying to sort out criminals on the streets of London. I'm not interested in people who are beyond our shores. But we need to get the police somehow to take note and to have a response to this. State level solidarity, dreaming big here, but it would be really, really good for more MPs to take a more principled stance and not be currying favour with some of these countries that are doing this on our shores. Tech support. One of the things that's really made the situation worse for lots of people are things like when Twitter became X and the blue tick was taken away. That blue tick protected quite a lot of dissidents in various ways, but one way was you knew that genuinely was the dissident. We now experience another form of kind of more creative transnational repression where certain dissidents like Badiou Sao, who's one of he's basically the Banksy of China, he wakes up every morning, and overnight so many people have impersonated his accounts to try and ruin his reputation, make him say things that he hasn't said, linked to a site saying it's selling his artwork when it isn't, and trying to just generally cause mayhem. And so it's just a very simple thing, Twitter taking that away. Most people, it affected their ego. For dissidents, it actually has really affected lots of their lives, and that could be reversed. Of course, we need to look at transnational repression on campus and what can be done. And, looping back to the Sussex fine, I mean, it does feel like stinging universities that are already so financially strapped, that are willing to take money from certain states. It doesn't feel like a great thing to do. And from there, let's see, there is so much more I think we can do. I don't think there are easy solutions, but we need to start opening up this conversation. Ghanem al-Masriya, the Saudi comedian, when he came over to the UK, as said, he wasn't even a dissident. That was not the path he was going to take. Until he was beaten up in 2018, he still would meet people, as he said, in central London. But he has really, really, really been destroyed. We did a comedy event last year, and we wanted him to talk at the comedy event, and he wrote the speech, and about 2 hours before it happened, he sent me a message saying he could not physically bring himself to come. He said that he wakes up in the morning and he feels okay, and by the time that it gets darker, his confidence goes, his fear creeps in, and he doesn't want to leave the house, so he couldn't get to the comedy club that night. There are so many people like Ghanem, sadly. So as said, I don't want to do the Suffering Olympics because I think that lots and lots of people have a right to feel incredibly aggrieved by treatment that's happened to them. But certainly in the UK, the idea that people from places like China have left to seek somewhere safer, and that they live into the shadows, afraid of where they're going, and that it's not paranoia in their head, that for me gives it the qualification of probably the most dangerous form of speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Jemimah, for a pretty sobering talk.
No, happy Friday.
I guess because we're on a university campus, I'm interested in what you think that universities can do about this. I mean, I know that it's something that universities think about. It's something they thought about, particularly in the pandemic, when a lot of teaching and assessment was online, and so it wasn't in the four walls of a room. But I wonder if you have any sort of practical recommendations or thoughts for universities.
I think there's the kind of there's this two-stage response to the problem, right? There's the dealing with the here and now, putting out the fire, really, and then there's actually making sure the forest is not so dry that it's going to have fires in the future. So I think the approach of anonymizing papers is the putting out the fire approach, and I think that's what you can do in the here and now. But in terms of long-term approaches, again, I think we have to understand the exact scale of the problem, and then we can talk about the solutions. I don't have many to hand at this stage. I would love to have more to hand.
Yeah. Well, perhaps talking about and identifying the problem is one of them. And I was also interested when you were talking about people whose speech is silenced because of fear of the reactions. And I think it's also about maybe having a nuanced idea of what free speech involves, which is sometimes trying to balance the rights of one person against another, like with the protest cases, for example.
Yeah.
You're trying to identify a way of holding the idea of what is stopping people speaking. It's not just literally say what you want and damn the consequences. It's recognising that the speech does have consequences, and we need to protect people sometimes from those.
Yeah, and I would be intrigued by some of the contracts that the universities go into. Like, I think it seems a bit strange that the university academic at UCL, that the response to a student challenging her was to cut her course rather than to say, rather than to put faith in her as the academic at the institution, that makes me think, what kind of fear and agreements, like both, have gone on behind the scenes that were not revealed. I mean, I think one of the things, and this is a point more broadly that we see for some of the free speech issues, is I think there's a lot of fear at the moment and not a lot of courage. I think people need to be a bit more resolute and firm in saying, these are the terms, and if you don't like it, go away, but we don't need you. But again, I'm not an academic who's trying to balance books. It's very easy for me to say it because my entire reason for my career is at this stage in time is basically to make this argument.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to open it out to some questions from the audience or comments. If you've got anything you want to ask, Jemimah, please say, and please wait for the microphones, which will come on each side. So yes, there's a hand there, and then Stephen just in front.
Hello. Academic freedom is immensely important, but I'd like you to comment on the tension, really, between academic freedom and academic institutions' responsibility not to be complicit in states that are accused or guilty of genocide, crimes against humanity, and so on.
I think that's a very good question, thank you, and a very, very difficult one. The arguments that I hear for, say, still having access and having presence in places like, for example, in China, given what's happening in Xinjiang, where I think that's been a bit more of a live issue over the years, is that if they're not there, that then these societies become more closed, and that it's better to have some exchange. I think I can empathize with that argument, but I can also see the other side, and it's an argument that you hear also beyond that. So there are British judges who still are on in the Supreme Court in Hong Kong for the same argument, that they think it's better that they come with some values of rule of law rather than just completely abandoning. But I think the other side of the argument is that you compromise yourself a lot, and you also, when you have, and I'm not going to say the names, I'm sure you're all aware, there are some really big, very prestigious UK universities with presences, lots of campuses in China, and when you see that, it feels like it's giving them quite a seal of approval that yes, you can, it is okay to have certain academics who are silenced, and that academic freedom is kind of taking a bit of a back seat here.
Stephen. Yeah.
Thank you. You've mentioned a number of different countries you've been monitoring for quite some while.
Yeah.
You did allude very briefly during your talk to the recent changes in the US. And I know it's a very new government there, relatively speaking, but we've already got some hint as to how things are changing. I just wondered whether you had any observations on the US situation with regard to this issue.
So the issues that I speak about today, I've spoken about it from the UK context because we're based in the UK, but the same things are happening in the US. So similar groups are being targeted in similar ways. I think what is incredibly challenging about the current moment in the US, and I alluded to it as well in terms of the Just Stop Oil protesters and things here, is that I think when you fall so much from grace ultimately from an ethical rights perspective, it makes it incredibly hard to yourself call governments out on it. So I think that if the Trump administration was to say, why have you say, hey, Saudi Arabia, Iran, China, why have you disappeared people from our streets? They could very easily stand back and say, well, you've disappeared your own people as well. So I think it makes it incredibly challenging to make the arguments.
One of the things that I think is interesting and troubling about what's happened in the United States, I think the speaker who talked about this in the Eric Brent lecture last week might be around, yes, hey, is undermining free speech in the name of free speech. I mean, defining as free speech that which is actually undercutting free speech, like like sacking the head of the Library of Congress for ostensibly blocking free speech when they've done no such thing, and then replacing them with someone more friendly to the administration. I mean, how do you think we? I mean, I suppose we haven't done that here yet, I don't think. But perhaps you. I mean, how do you think we should be speaking out on those things to a country that's traditionally been seen as a bastion of free speech, wherever else one criticises America for?
It's incredibly difficult, and actually, from my own perspective, I sometimes, more regularly at the moment, are shifting myself how I define index. I would have said free speech quite willy-nilly when I first started in 2017, and now, and this is a problem that predates Trump, but I think free speech has got a bad reputation. Freedom of expression feels different, feels a bit softer. I think people have more of a sense of that it's a rights-based value. And so I'm finding even myself saying more often than not freedom of expression. And mostly that's happened post-Trump. As I said, I think the kind of the gutting of free speech of meaning happened before. But I would say that Trump and Musk and Vance are, you know, they're the kind of free speech for me, not for thee, which is not free speech. It's completely bumpkus. They don't believe in it. And it's just, it is making it incredibly challenging to champion that value because people don't understand what it is anymore, and they just think it's something that is weaponized against them. And again, linking back to these, it makes it hard when you have governments that will define what hate speech is and things according to their own whims. So, you know, places like Saudi Arabia, we've just been working on a case this week of a British Yemeni national, well, he's a British national, but I think his family are from Yemen, and he was on holiday in Saudi Arabia, and he was arrested, and he's just been sentenced to 10 years. And he was accused of, through a tweet, of being a security threat for saying something that's not remotely a security threat according to a universal rights-based sense of what a security threat would be defined as. But when you have these governments who twist these terms and say ultimately left is right and right is upside down, when the US becomes that government, again, it becomes really, really hard.
Sam.
Hi, thanks very much. It's a question about the UK government, really, and the fact that the UK government is one of the governments pushing companies, Apple, Meta, WhatsApp, Signal, to open backdoors into their end-to-end encryption messaging apps. And Apple recently caved, and advanced data protection from Apple is no longer available in the UK, and I think we're the only democracy where that's not available anymore. Yet we're saying, dissidents in the UK need to be protected, and technically, and we talked about spyware and how insidious it is, and so on and so forth. But what do we do about the UK being one of the enablers of these tools and these mechanisms for dissidents in these shores and others, protesters and so on and so forth, to be attacked? And I'd be interested in your position and what you're doing about it, if you are.
We actually do. Thank you very much for that. We do a huge amount to protect and promote end-to-end encryption. It's one of our big campaigns because, on a completely selfish level, I can't do what I do without it. I have a very active Signal group with people who are either from Afghanistan or based in Afghanistan. Since Kabul fell, it's been very, very active. It's been a lifeline for lots of people. It's been incredibly useful for me to get information on what's happening there on the ground. And if we break end-to-end encryption, if we open that back door, that group would go overnight. So from a completely, and also, to be honest, because there are things in my phone that people might want. I'm not the highest profile, I'm not Nathan Law, but I am the chief exec of a freedom of expression organization. So I communicate with all my staff via end-to-end encrypted apps. So I couldn't do what I did, but I'm not the issue here. My organisation is not the issue. The issue is for these people who would be completely starved of ways to contact people if we open the back door. Because if you open the back door in the UK, it's for everyone. It's worldwide. Then anyone who's is using a UK server people can have access to it. There's also just some fundamental things, and again, it comes back to this idea of principle. It would destroy our privacy. We don't want people to be able to snoop on our phone, so why should they be able to snoop on our landline? So why should they be able to snoop in our phone? So we have to stick by the principle as well that we need privacy rights protected. I send a lot of letters to MPs. I've sat down with an MP back in March about it. We are constantly trying to message Peter Kyle about it. Also trying to just get the average person to understand, because again, my Afghan example, most people would see that example and they would go, oh, I'm not in a network with people from Kabul, what do I care? But people share on WhatsApp, they share intimate photos, they share their bank details. They share things that they might not even think would get them in trouble. Like they might share that they're in a relationship with another man and want to go on holiday to Dubai. Like they share all kinds of things. So people should just as a natural right have privacy. And so we try and get them to understand through some of our messaging as well why it's not just about dissidents. It is just that if you don't have privacy, if it goes for everyone, it impacts everyone. But, let's see what we can do. We did challenge with Big Brother Watch. We did successfully challenge the UK government trying to hold the tribunal in secret. And so now they're going to have it partially in the open. So there are many people who are very organised here. And it's the one area where, even though it's commercially minded, the tech companies are on our side and will throw money at it. So...
Damien, and then the person next to him. Yeah.
Thanks for a great lecture, and thanks for all you do at Index on these important issues. I want to ask you a question about Index and as an organisation, and if you like, the questions you mentioned before about definitions of free speech and freedom of expression, and how, in a sense, you set your priorities within the organisation. And it strikes me, if you think about, maybe you can say something about it, the longer-term history of Index on censorship, that in a sense, it started off with an emphasis on calling out state censorship in foreign states. But what you've spoken about today is really about the long arm of foreign states having censorship effects in this country. And I mean, I guess the question I have with it is that a kind of departure for Index? And is that because the world is changing and the underlying kind of concepts and theories of what censorship is in this new geopolitical national security environment might be? And secondly, isn't it quite difficult to draw a line between the action of states in some of the kind of chilling speech that you were speaking about, pylons online, etc., and even some of the other examples you gave of slaps, etc., these are non-state actors, which in some definitions, particularly First Amendment definitions, wouldn't be described as censorship.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, my question, I'm Dr. Chin, and also used to work for the Oxford Law faculty. So my area is the freedom of speech as well, and also digital law. So actually, my question is quite related to Damien's questions. So basically, so the background is that it's similar question. If the dissent from Hong Kong, actually they was, if the government in Hong Kong, for example, they said, basically violate the national security law, so that's why you escaped the punishment and you escaped to Britain. So the government probably will issue, the Hong Kong government, for example, they probably will issue a warrant, to arrest you. So therefore, so if you talk about legalities, then probably we're talking about state solidarity. So what the UK government should respond if they said this is something illegal, violate national security? But of course, the validity of national security law or even the legitimacy of national security law is subject to dispute, of course. But just talk about law itself. So how the UK government should respond if they say this is illegal? Okay. The second question actually is really...
Yeah, is it because we're slightly over time already, but if you do it quickly, go on.
Yeah, sorry. The second question actually is about why those students, because you mentioned the student in UCL, but there's another instance, for example, in Liverpool University, they have a similar instance. Why the foreign students have this kind of emotional, you can say abuse or online abuse towards the people come from the same society? So I want to understand, probably you have done some research about that.
Okay, so thank you both. Okay, so in terms of Index, so we did start in 1972, formally, was the first ever magazine. We were founded in we were founded in the early 70s. In 68, we received a telegram from Russian Soviet protesters in Red Square who were protesting against the invasion of Czechoslovakia, and they were intellectuals and they were all arrested, and there were 8 of them, and they sent a telegram in the Times saying, we want people to be aware of what's happening to us. And what happened was Iris Murdoch and Stephen Spender and a few others said, we are not just going to be aware of what's happening to you, we're going to create an organisation. That became Index, and what we're going to do is we're going to publish stories about what's happening to you. We don't have a manifesto, unhelpfully, but we did have a founding essay from Stephen Spender, and he talked about how Index would always be global because the impulse to censor was not something that just happened in the Soviet Union. And so in the first issue, you can see articles from Greece, from Argentina. Because he talked about the kind of more the impulses to censor, and the importance, he also talked about the importance of looking what happened at home and being always on guard. We look at impulses wherever they manifest, whether it comes from the state level or from the bottom up. In the years since then, of course, things like the internet have changed people's ability to censor people. Now, that doesn't mean that there wasn't censorship from people on a lower level at the bottom. I mean, we only need to look to the Cultural Revolution to see that you can always have movements that both kind of come from the top but also come from the bottom. But essentially, it is much easier now to just attack someone in a way that it wasn't before, and to feel like you have reach to these people. In terms of the question of how we define freedom of expression, we are not absolutist because we believe that the absolutist approach at stages, if someone is saying something in such a way that constitutes very visceral harassment or threats, it can stop the free expression of someone else. But we do try and make sure that we are as tolerant as possible for speech, so we don't have a huge amount of time for people talking about offence if it's that they feel offended, that their views have been offended. But as said, we do sometimes have 1% of cases that come to us where people will say, I've been censored, and we will have to really think hard about from all different angles. So that's kind of where Index is in that respect. In terms of international, when it's a government like Hong Kong's national security law, which I'm also pretty sure I violated, because it's quite easy to violate it. It's got an extra territorial element to it, which says that if you're doing speech that's considered to be against national security, and their view of against national security is to call for human rights there, you can violate it. So I have publicly, when it got passed in 2020, I did write for The Independent an article saying how absolutely outrageous it is, and I'm pretty sure that article alone was a violation of the law. hence I will not go to Hong Kong. But in terms of where we stand organisationally and where we would expect somewhere like the UK to stand, there are international human rights, international laws that protect and promote freedom of expression as we define, you know, Article 19 of the Human Rights Act, Article 10, I think, of the European Convention of Human Rights, and they're similar, you know, those are the approaches that we take, which is most speech should be allowed, but there needs to be guardrails to ensure that it does not endanger other people's access to speech too. And Hong Kong does not comply with that. Like, there is nothing, the people who are in jail in Hong Kong and the people who are being threatened over here, they're not national security threats. They simply, this is people like Jimmy Lai who simply just turned up at vigils with candles to honor people who were killed 30 years earlier. So I think we have to stick to some hard and fast principles globally, otherwise the entire system just collapses.
Okay, I'm going to stop now. I'm sorry, I let you overrun. You're probably exhausted, but that was all absolutely fascinating. Thank you all very much for coming and engaging. Next week, same time, we will have a speaker, David Coles, who will be speaking. He's the former legal director of the American Civil Liberties Union, and he will be talking about attacks on the Constitution in America. So we'll continue our cheery theme, but it will be very interesting, and he's an extraordinary speaker, so do come along. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking Jemimah for a wonderful talk.